Hello, History72B Spring Quarter 2023. At the time that I'm recording this, we are at about the halfway point. Maybe when you watch it, we'll be at the 2/3 point. Anyway, check your points at this stage of the game and make sure that you are accumulating points at the rate that you want so you don't get hit during finals week. This is the third lecture in Package D. I've called this lecture Bodily Autonomy, because that is what it is really about, the right to not have the state interfere in our bodies for any purpose. We will start by looking at the types of birth control available specifically to women in the early 20th century. I say available to, but of course, after the Comstock Law went into effect, these were not readily available to women. One of your readings in this package covers condoms, so I won't be talking about them here. We left off our discussion of birth control on syringes for douching, with the added convenience of rubber tubing that was flexible. Maurice Esquissier, a French obstetrician, introduced a self-acting irrigator in 1843. It remained in production for the next 75 years and proved popular owing to its automatic operation. The user filled the reservoir, wound up the spring drive, and then released it to activate the plunger, thereby pumping fluid out of the irrigator's nozzle. This was the same year scientists showed definitively that conception occurs in human reproduction when the sperm enters the female egg. Prior to this, the assumption that men created life and women just provided the home for it maintained popularity, albeit not universally, as you probably know from earlier lectures. In the 1870s, a wide assortment of birth control devices were available in America, including condoms, sponges, douching syringes, diaphragms, and cervical caps. These could be easily procured from catalogs, pharmacists, dry goods stores, and even rubber vendors. Unfortunately, none of these was effective more than 50% of the time. Then, in 1873, Congress passed the Comstock Act, which criminalized using the U.S. Postal Service to mail anything considered obscene, including contraceptives, abortifacients, sex toys, or any literature related to these. In other words, advertising offering and pamphlets explaining birth control were classed as obscene. The Comstock Act authorized the Postal Service to confiscate birth control sold through the mail. The law's chief proponent and namesake, Anthony Comstock, became a special agent for the U.S. Postal Service in order to enforce the law. I love this little cartoon here. It was created in 1888 when Comstock was in his heyday. And it says, that fertile imagination. Comstock is shown arresting an artist for depicting a presumably naked woman who is almost totally submerged and so not visible. Don't you suppose I can imagine what is under the water? In other words, it's basically calling Comstock a hypocrite and a perv. In 1880, Dr. Wilhelm Mansinga, a German scientist, invented a larger cervical cap. His model gained widespread popularity and came to be known as the diaphragm. The type of gold wishbone stem pessary shown on the slide was an intracervical device, or IUC. These contraceptive tools came into use towards the end of the 1800s. The flat end of the stem pessary sat against the vaginal wall with a stem protruding into the uterus through the cervix. In contrast to this sort of IUC, the modern IUD sits entirely within the uterus, reducing the risk of bacterial transfer between the cervix and the uterus, which can lead to infection and sterility. In 1886, the first commercially manufactured birth control suppository was produced in England by London chemist W.J. Rindle. The quinine and cacao nut butter suppository known as Rindle's was somewhat effective and commonly used in England until World War II. Viennese gynecologist Emil Nauer discovered the existence of chemicals that control the body's metabolic processes in 1890. In 1905, the mysterious chemicals were named hormones, from the Greek hormao, to stir up or incite. This would be the first step toward hormonal birth control, as well as defining sex by hormone levels rather than physical structures. But birth control would be the slower of the two to be developed. Douching was recommended by doctors during the 19th and early 20th centuries as a method of contraception. It was also often advertised as essential to feminine hygiene. Women were encouraged to believe that they would smell unpleasant if they didn't douche, and because douching kits were fairly inexpensive, they were a popular choice. Unfortunately, some solutions used in them had harmful effects, causing irritation, inflammation, and burns. Additionally, douching was largely ineffective as a contraceptive method. Barrier methods date back centuries, if not millennia, with items such as leaves, lemons, and sponges being used to block sperm from the uterus. The example on this slide is from the 1910s, when sponges often came attractively designed in storage containers and were marketed for feminine hygiene. Both natural and synthetic rubber sponges were popular by the 1930s and 1940s, as they were readily available and relatively easy to use. Vaginal douches like the Omega spray, shown here, made during the first half of the 20th century were used to insert substances intended to remove and kill sperm. Effective or not, the marketing based on personal hygiene plus hope proved to make the douche an incredibly long-lasting method. And I do not even know what to say about the whirling spray here. There are a number of douches that advertise this, and I honestly shudder to think what it means. We are now caught up with the varieties of contraception that women were either legally denied, for example, by the Comstock Law, or that women had forced on them, for example, for sterilization campaigns in the early 20th century. One of the most publicly visible faces in the struggle for women's bodily autonomy at the beginning of the 20th century was Margaret Sanger. As a girl, Margaret Sanger saw her mother die in her 18th pregnancy. 11 of those resulted in live births, including Margaret Sanger. Sanger went on to become a public health nurse in the poor immigrant neighborhoods of New York City and one of the most important birth control activists in the U.S. Unfortunately, she also became a eugenicist later in life. My advice is to have heroic acts that you appreciate, but never have actual heroes. People are human and will inevitably let you down at some point. Between 1911 and 1913, Sanger wrote 2 series of columns on sex education, which were titled What Every Mother Should Know, published between 1911 and 1912, and What Every Girl Should Know, published from 1912 to 1913, and she wrote these for the socialist magazine New York Call. The columns were also published, once they were all finished, in book form, which is what you are looking at. In her own radical journal, The Woman Rebel, Margaret Sanger drew attention to times when women might want to avoid pregnancy, such as in the case of illness or poverty. Sanger did not give specific instructions regarding methods for contraception in her journal, but the New York City postmaster banned the journal under the Comstock Law category of obscene, lewd, and lascivious matter. Margaret Sanger coined the term birth control and used the phrase in the June 1914 issue of The Woman Rebel, an issue that Sanger sent out in the Post. Sanger was indicted for 9 violations of the Comstock Law. Sanger moved to England to continue her work, evading conviction on the obscenity charges for the time being. Sanger recognized enforced motherhood, and this is a quote from her, "Enforced motherhood is the most complete denial of a woman's right to life and liberty." Anthony Comstock died in 1915, but by that time his anti-birth control laws had become entrenched, as had resistance to them. In New York City, a group of women formed the National Birth Control League, an antecedent of the International Planned Parenthood Federation. In 1916, Sanger returned to New York to face trial. The charges against her were actually dropped, but she continued to challenge the Comstock laws. Also in 1916, Sanger and her sister and a friend opened the first birth control clinic in America in Brooklyn, New York. For the first time in American history, women could receive organized and up-to-date instruction in birth control. After only 10 days, Sanger's clinic was raided by the Vice Squad and shut down. The women were arrested, and all of the condoms and diaphragms at the clinic were confiscated. The next year, a New York court convicted Sanger of maintaining a public nuisance by dispensing contraceptive devices and sentenced her to jail for 30 days. Once released, Sanger reopened her clinic and continued to push back against official opposition to woman-controlled contraception through more arrests and prosecutions. In 1917, she began publishing the magazine Birth Control Review as an act of civil disobedience, as well as to educate the public about contraception. In 1918, African American women's groups in New York City began to hold public lectures on birth control. These groups were also extremely active in the women's suffrage movement. Also in 1918, in the case of People versus Sanger, the New York State Court of Appeals reversed the criminal conviction of Margaret Sanger, ruling that New York's limitations on the distribution of birth control were unconstitutional because they infringed upon women's liberties by forcing them to conceive more children than they wanted. So just note that's the New York State Court of Appeals and not the national one. Spermicidal products, which kill sperm, made barrier methods more effective, so you use both at the same time. As we have seen, in 1885, English pharmacist Walter Rindle was credited with developing the first commercially available spermicidal suppository, which contained cocoa butter and quinine sulfate. Although it had long been known that there was a fertile time and a non-fertile time in a woman's cycle, scientists had not understood the timings of these fluctuations until the 1920s. Independently of each other, gynecologists Kiyosaka Ogino and Hermann Naus connected ovulation to fertilization, which then allowed people to somewhat reliably calculate fertility using a calendar. Other signs like body temperature and changes in vaginal mucus helped to refine the so-called rhythm method. This research also paved the way for hormonal contraception. We will look a bit at the ProRace brand on the cervical cap and spermicidal suppositories in the next slide. It is as bad as you may be inclined to think. Also in the 1920s, German gynecologist Ernst Grafenberg devised this intrauterine device on the right, or IUD, appropriately called the Grafenberg's ring. It became a popular form of contraceptive, at least as far as we can tell from doctors' records. The IUD did have the advantage of not being detectable to one's sexual partner. Once put in place by a physician, the IUD stays until it is removed. Early IUDs were made of things like silkworm gut and silver wire. IUDs have undergone substantial redesign, but remain popular now. You are looking at two contraceptive caps, also called cervical caps, vaults or diaphragm caps, from 1920. Just as a reminder, cervical caps act as a barrier to sperm entering the uterus. The ProRace rubber cap was developed by Dr. Marie Stopes, who opened the first family planning clinic in the UK in 1921. Be careful with these activist names. They have the same initials. So it's Marie Stopes in the UK and Margaret Sanger in the US. The ProRace brand name refers to the eugenics movement. Eugenics, as defined in the West, is racist and ableist ideology. Stopes supported negative eugenics, which advocated contraceptive to remove undesirables from society. Here in the US, despite disagreeing with some of the ideas of the eugenicists who were part of the mainstream scientific establishment of the day, Sanger sought legitimacy for her controversial demand for birth control by aligning with the eugenicists. In 1920, Margaret Sanger publicly stated that, quote, Birth control is nothing more or less than the facilitation of the process of weeding out the unfit and of preventing the birth of defectives. 1920 was also the year that the 19th Amendment was ratified, giving women the right to vote at the federal level. In 1923, Margaret Sanger successfully opened the first legal birth control clinic in the U.S. To be legally approved, Sanger had to state that the intent of the clinic was only to distribute contraceptives for medical purposes, such as the prevention of life-threatening pregnancies. Stim pessaries, like you're looking at in the slide here, were and are intrauterine devices, or IUDs. The stim held the larger block in place. Stim pessaries were a common gynecological treatment in the late 1800s and early 1900s, used to help with conditions such as prolapsed uterus. Stim pessaries were also used as contraceptives. The intrauterine stim pessary in the middle is made of bone with a catgut loop. The aluminum stim pessary was made by German company Rauch. The one on the left is made of glass, which gives me a bit of the heebie-jeebies, but your mileage may vary. You would think that forced sterilization would be considered the ultimate invasion of bodily autonomy, and indeed, one case against forced sterilization went all the way to the Supreme Court to decide that very issue. Beginning in 1907, the United States instituted public policies that gave the government the right to sterilize unwilling and unwitting people. Indiana enacted the nation's first compulsory sterilization law in 1907. By 1929, 30 states had similar laws. These laws listed the insane, the feeble-minded, the dependent, and the diseased as incapable of regulating their own reproductive abilities, thereby justifying government-forced sterilizations. State officials used these laws disproportionately to target Black women, Native American women, and poor women and girls. Birth prevention may not be woman-controlled or liberating. Birth control is about more than preventing pregnancies for women who do not want to be pregnant. It is also about preventing pregnancies in women who do want to be pregnant, and this is negative eugenics. In 1927, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Buck v. Bell that coercive sterilization did not violate the U.S. Constitution. To justify the decision, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. infamously said, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." You were looking at Carrie Buck on the left with her own mother, Emma, in 1924. Carrie underwent surgical sterilization against her wishes. One of your readings for this package covers forced sterilization in more detail, and I will read you more of Holmes's quote. 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. It is better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. I leave it to you to read all of the assumptions that are written into that may or may not be true, largely not true. In 1928, almost 30 years after the discovery of hormones, scientists at the University of Rochester in New York identified progesterone, the ovarian hormone. They concluded that this hormone played a crucial role in enabling and sustaining a pregnancy. The human sex hormone estrogen was isolated and identified by Edward Doisy at Washington University in St. Louis in 1929. And of course, levels of those would become critical to the birth control pill. Key points for Lecture 14. In the first few decades of the 20th century, American women had limited access to information about birth control because of the Comstock Act targeting vice. Douches were popular because doctors recommended them for feminine hygiene, and they were relatively cheap, although not particularly effective for birth control. Sponges were more effective and could now be made from rubber. Margaret Sanger led campaigns against the Comstock law and started illegal birth control clinics until finally able to open the first legal clinic in 1923. Unfortunately, Sanger, in later life, that should read life and not live, and like Stopes in England, turned to eugenics to gain support for birth control, particularly from the mainstream scientific community. The U.S. passed its first forced compulsory sterilization law in 1907. In 1927, the Supreme Court approved forced sterilization in its decision in Buck v. Bell, with the infamous justification that 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. This is a Dalkon shield, a type of IUD or intrauterine device marketed in the late 1960s to early 1970s. Unfortunately, several design flaws meant that it caused infections and it was taken off the market. The coda including this is quite short today. This is a German tang or tournament shield made around 1500, not meant to be inserted anywhere in the body. The motto in German around the owl translates to, "Although I am the hated bird, I rather enjoy that."